Last year I spoke about Halloween monsters, the classic monsters that haunted screens and homes from the 1930s to the 1960s and do, in some regards, still to this day. But horror movies marched on with time, and the monsters within them would have to change. No longer did audiences find Dracula or Frankenstein's monster particularly scary. So, horror movie monsters had to evolve, become scarier, more complicated. This was both because of the changing tastes and advances in technology. Practical effects of the 70s and 80s and also into the 90s moved forward leaps and bounds and allowed incredible monsters to be brought to life. There's a reason why The Thing, American Werewolf in London, Pumpkinhead, Alien all still hold up to modern day viewers in terms of look. These are some of the best practical effects in film, and comparatively, late 90s and early 2000s horror movies that relied on CGI instead have not aged as well. Also, I feel like moving out of the classic horror monster movie thing, there was more a lean towards what we would consider horror movie villains. Not necessarily what one might envision as a monster, though I do think they still count. These include Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Ghostface, Leatherface, Chucky. These are the villains of horror and monsters of horror that would emerge in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s as staples of their franchise, the thing that kind of tied all of them together, haunting a lot of times different casts, but a lot of the time also the same characters between them. Franchises grew off the popularity of these new horror movie villains instead of the old monsters, though they still found their way into becoming staples of the genre. It seemed that the 80s and 90s were the best years for new iconic horror movie villains and monsters. The 2000s harkened in a new era of horror movies, though, one that relied a lot on jump scares and excessive gore and blood. Not always, of course, but a lot more than before, leading to what I would consider a downturn in cool or very prominent monsters in favor of highlighting gruesome kills or stuff like that. Some examples of 21st century horror movie monsters that have gained icon status are Jigsaw, arguably Captain Spaulding from House of Thousand Corpses and the Devil's Rejects, maybe Annabelle or Samara from The Ring, though the original Japanese film Ringu came out in 1998, so it doesn't really count as the 2000s. It's notable that these aren't big monsters. They're people in makeup or smaller dolls, like Chucky, but the practical effects required to bring them to life aren't as elaborate as something like Pumpkinhead. While big boxes horror successes like 2017 remake of Stephen King's It and The Nun count on special effects and multi-million-dollar budgets to deliver scares, they're no less relevant to horror culture than early classics. They're just different. Often the longer a franchise goes on, the more the quality dwindles. This is the case outside of horror as well. Although some franchises, like The Evil Dead, have managed to continue on with relatively consistent quality. But that's not a franchise built around a specific monster or villain, whereas in many franchises is something just the villain, like Jason and Friday the 13th, that ties all the films together. A horror movie sometimes can only be as good as its monsters, but at the same time, a horror movie monster can sometimes only be as good as its movie. But it really depends. Like I said, what scares people nowadays is so different and so varied, so there's tons of different horror movie villains and monsters that vary wildly. There really isn't a consistent kind of idea nowadays. Sometimes the villains are just normal people that act monstrously, like Leatherface or Hannibal Lecter. And there are many villains that toe the line between human and the supernatural. A monster, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is an imaginary, frightening creature, especially one that is large and strange. And while large isn't necessarily prominent in all of these, strange, imaginary, frightening, arguably that makes all of the villains that you might think they count as monsters, as they are frightening and imagined by the creators that made the movies, and thus then imagined by the viewers. Horror is not a monster-forward or creature feature time anymore. The villain is usually something else, something not quite so tactile, like the weird smile thing in Smile or the alien in Nope. But there are still monster-focused horror movies. A ton of them. A lot of low-budget ones like the endless Cocaine Bear clones that have come out recently, or Terrifier movies, and the classic franchises like Halloween that keep going. I think is it done yet? I'm not actually sure. But the monster of modern horror is often something less tangible. And I'm not the first to point out the surge in 2010s and especially 2020s horror movies that are concepts or representative of ideas. Tanarov Du writes in Get Out and the black horror aesthetic that horror as a genre allows you to reframe true life trauma on the screen as imaginary monsters and demons, making monsters allegories for real-life issues like racism, sexism, and homophobia. And within the film, the monster can be defeated. And this has been a thing for a very long time. This isn't necessarily a modern thing. Even arguably the classic Universal monsters and classic Halloween monsters also represented these real-life fears that people had, but taking on a supernatural form. But now it's more social issues or different traumas, that sort of thing, which has taken a prominence in a lot of recent horror movies. This allows in kind of escape because, like I said, within these movies, those issues can be solved by killing a monster. There are many examples of the progression of many horror movies from using literal monsters to more abstract conceptual monsters. Elise Johnson writes that the horror of these movies does arise in part from the literal manifestations of systems of oppression, trauma, and so on, be it a top hat wearing ghoul, a pagan cult, or a killer suburban family. But the horror also arises from what these monsters represent, or what injustice or social concern they are grounded in. Horror movies are full of monsters. Literal, metaphorical, and both. And they will continue to scare on screen for the foreseeable future, because as long as the story they inhabit is good, the monster can thrive. Be it killer clown, shape-shifting horror from outer space, possessed doll, or normal people. There are still the classic monsters being used in adaptations to this day, and there are still lots of monster-focused horror movies, good and bad ones. And I wish horror movies would return to at least using more practical effects. You know, if you have the budget for it, you might as well. It's gonna look better than CGI, trust me. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there. And from me and my boy Chucky, happy Halloween.